Kenjitsu becomes Kendo, Jitsu becomes Iaido, Aiki Jiu-Jitsu or Jiu-Jitsu to Aikido or Jiu-Jitsu becomes Judo. Is there something lost in the way that they're translated in terms of, I guess, practicality? Does it become more ritualized than perhaps it needs to be? What are your thoughts? Are these transformations, is there something lost when you try to apply a do to a jitsu?
Kia ora, welcome to the Invisible Sensei podcast. This is a podcast about my experiences as a martial artist, as a student, as a teacher, as someone who from time to time has stubbed their toes on the problems of the world and kind of gone, what am I doing this for? Please take time to check out the link in the description. It will take you to our YouTube channel and also to our profiles on social media, which you're most welcome to check out and contact us on. We also have a wonderful merch shop where you can grab cups and a couple of other things if you're wanting to support the podcast, or if you're wanting to support it more directly, we have a link that you can do that also. Either way, enjoy the podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in, and keep training, keep smiling, keep enjoying, and most importantly, keep developing.
Let's start with the first one. My interpretation of or the comparison of Kenjitsu to Kendo. As you said, I studied under Toshishiro Obata for 30 years, training in his Gendai Budo, his modern Budo of Shinkendo. Shinkendo translates as the true sword way. Kendo, of course, sword way, the way of the sword. If you look at some other sword arts, let's say Koru arts, they sometimes don't include a full package of training. Okay, so I would classify Shinkendo more as a Kenjitsu art, where you learn how to swing the sword, not just, but how to move and swing the sword, how to move in different angles, how to change the direction of the sword. So different ways. The Suburi aspect of the art is fairly large. So it gives you an idea how to swing. Then you've got your drawing, standing draws. We'll get to Jitsu and Iaido in a second, but standing draws. How are you going to draw your sword and cut? How are you going to cut multiple times? How are you going to do the ritualistic chiburi, put your sword away? So you're learning how to handle a real sword in and out of a scabbard. And then there's ritualized kata. How can what can we learn from a solo kata? Drawing a sword, moving in different directions. What am I imagining? What might this application be? What is this application in the kata? What is the application? How would it change in maybe real an encounter? Because we only have in our imagination. And in Shinkendo, we did no free sparring. Our next aspect. So we went through Suburi, we went through Bato, we went through Tanren Kata, and then we had our paired practice. So prearranged paired practice, done slowly at first, done deliberately, then learning off timing, learning more speed, more power. That kind of thing, even though it's prearranged, can start to change the dynamics of the encounter. And then the last part is taking a real sword and cutting stuff. What does it feel like to cut? It's your hasuji and tachisuji, angle of my sword cut, hasuji, angle of my edge. Is all of that consistent and true? So can you actually cut something with a real sword? So that's, in my mind, a full, true Kenjitsu art. Now you take Kendo. They're suburi. They got their right foot forward. They jump back and forth, right? There's not a variety of different cuts. Their training, of course, is to score points. So they're trying to figure out, how can I move and score a point and make it so that the judge looks at that point and my strike with a shinai as if it was a real sword and not just a tap. So you can touch a part like, oh no, that's not a point, because it wasn't as if it was a real sword. So, and they do some setai kata, and they do a little bit of tachi-uchi practice, but it's not a lot, and it doesn't transfer over into their kendo. Kendo is completely different again. So what was lost? The true way of the sword, the true handling of a real sword. There's been instances where a real sword is handed to a kendo person with a target in front of them. Here, you've been training for 40 years, your 8th dan, your 7th dan, go cut that. And because they haven't really handled a real sword, they can't do it. Again, getting back to my original thing, put me in a bogu, in a shinai, I haven't done kendo. I'm going to be at a disadvantage. But that's what's lost, right? What's lost, I think, in most Kenjitsu arts, there wasn't, from what I've read, there wasn't a lot of free sparring. There was this mostly prearranged stuff. So, I could learn something from the kendo setting, but I think a kendo person can learn more from this other setting about true, what I believe is true Japanese swordsmanship. That could be argued, but what I believe is true Japanese swordsmanship, a true knowledge of, a full knowledge of the sword. Then you got Iai-Jitsu in the Iaido. I think if we're talking an Iai-Jitsu, how can you do your bato draw? How can you draw from a standing position? How did it end up on the knees with a long sword? You would never kneel down with a long sword in your obi. So it's become this meditative thing, and posture and balance and calming. And so what is it? It's lost completely. I think it's martial application. And Aikijitsu to Aikido. Who knows? Well, we can know because there's books out there. The early books of Ueshiba Sensei, O Sensei. How many techniques were discarded from the Aiki Budo era that Nirai Doshu Kishimaru said, we need to fashion Aikido sort of after the war. That how do we compact this into something that we can deliver to the masses? So some techniques that might have been, now this might be a little too dangerous. We need to drop this out. But Aikijitsu, we're looking at things that it's application. I really need to subdue this person. I really need to actually use it in a more real life sense. In nearly 50 years, I've had one stupid altercation at work, right? And another stupid altercation in a parking lot where a guy tried to run me over, and I said something, and he got a little angry. But I just kind of moved away and he was disappointed that he couldn't hit me, and then took off after a lengthy verbal assault. But I've never really had to use Aikido, not in the physical sense. It's can it be my compass?
Just on that, I guess sort of, time is going so quickly, and there's so many things I want to ask. We might have to do we might have to go up to part 12 just to get through all of this. Sensei, one of the things which is really interesting is that how I actually came to meet you was actually through Pedro Bernardi Sensei of the Rubukan. And what struck me and my desire to interview you was you were on a Udancha grading panel at Bernardi Sensei's invitation. And some of the feedback and some of the questions that you were asking of the candidates was so interesting to me, and looking at things from such a different way that it was very, very much intriguing and made me question my own thinking. When you view other martial arts, do you view it as, are you looking for the Aikido? Like you did a really wonderful breakdown of the thinking behind a specific kata, perhaps not knowing that kata, and talked about Zanshin and those sorts of things. When you look at other martial arts, are you looking through the eyes of Aikido? Are you looking through the eyes of Shin Kendo or Iaido and the other things that you've done? Or are you looking at that martial art in and of itself?
I think I'm looking at it with maybe with the same eyes I would look at a ballet dance, or a juggler, or any other physical activity that shares the principles that we're all working on, right? If I see somebody doing nuki-uchi, drawing their sword, and they're leaning forward and their back heel is up, I go, I'm looking at that as a structural problem. Look at they need to learn something about their structure, right? I'm not judging it. That could have been a stick. That could have been a knife. It could have been anything. But I'm looking at, okay, well, would that have done something, right? Are they just moving their arm and not the point of their sword or the tip of their knife? Just the same way as a ballerina doing, can't see my hand. Am I a ballerina doing this with their hand, or are they doing this twist and movement that moves through their whole body? Just like a kung fu person that takes a spear or something and it's twisting. You could see that twist goes all the way through their body, anchored in their feet, and got this hand in front of my face, anchored in their feet. You can compare both of those with, it's the principles. I'm looking at principles. Spend any time on Facebook, you're going to see a Wing Chun guy, a Kali, a Eskrima guy, a guy doing nice things. I'll look at some things and go, well, that would never work, but it's interesting practice, like sword taking. I wish I could show you the welts I did have when I encountered Obata Sensei telling me, you can't take a sword from somebody. Well, of course you can. I've trained in Aikido for so many years. Yes, you can take a sword. No, you can't. No, you can't. Here, let me show you. And he took a shinai. I'm glad he took a shinai because it hurt. And he goes, you believe me now? I go, of course, I believe you. He go, if I just cut it without, I go, but I can see you move. It's very, very difficult, you know. And Munenori Yagyu, who made up these techniques about how often could you do that? Maybe 1 out of 10 times. So, gonna help you. You hope you'll have that one person all the time. So I look at some things, I go, well, that would never work. But it's a good practice. They're practicing their posture, they're practicing their principles, they're practicing these and things. So that's what I look at. When I look at other movement arts, whether it's a martial art or anything else, that's what I look at. And once you do, you begin to appreciate. You go, no, I know how hard that male ballet dancer, I know how hard it was for them to jump, twist, keep their posture, come back down again, and then not just land, but land and move without, that's hard. Once you understand movement, you understand how hard that is, and you begin to appreciate it more. It's not just this, oh, that was so cool. No, that was so cool because it was hard. It's hard to do. That's kind of how I view sort of other martial arts. It's not in a judgmental way. It's too much in a judgmental way. Of course, you can look at bad martial arts and you go, that's just bad martial arts.
something can be learned from everybody. There's something in it for everybody. Just on that, Sensei, which brings us to an interesting point. Aikido have a really well-established and I think a really healthy respect for the relationship between uke and tori. And from my way of thinking, in terms of I do Okinawan karate, I think that from that perspective, the idea of collaborative practice in which both people are working on technique and able to have a mutual exchange is an extremely valuable exercise. And tegumi, or close-in grappling, and those sort of practices have been very, very popular in the last few years. What do you think, with your experience both of seeing and I guess being an advisor to other martial arts, and in particular karate, we'll say karate, in your experience, could karate take from adopting a principle based around uke and tori in terms of exchange of technique?
Yes. But that's in my belief, it's the hardest thing to do. When somebody walks into the Aikido dojo, my dojo, the hardest thing to do is to explain that relationship, right? And so I go through these steps of trying to instill in the pairs of people. Let's say they both don't understand. I go, look, we've got a movie going. Frame. Okay. So let's take a grab. All right. We do a lot of grabs in Aikido. All right. So frame. So I go, we're stopping at this frame, right? The next frame is going to be maybe this, okay? But we have to understand this. We're trying to understand this, all right? So if you take your frame and you go, I don't want to go to the next frame. I refuse to go to the next frame. That wouldn't happen in real life, in my understanding, because there's motion. So there's motion. But when we stop and we want to examine, how do we get from this frame to this frame, this movement? How do we get from one movement to the next movement? Right. And how my whole body, I have to have some, as the attacking person is tori, I have to have some, or uke, I have to have some sense of I'm providing what's needed to understand the next frame. And then I'm providing whatever technique we're going to do, what's needed to understand the next frame. Now, in so doing, I begin to understand how would I attack? How would I change my structure? How could I keep my structure moving? Because maybe I want to learn how to turn that attack or this technique around. So I think what benefits both parties is understanding this progression. How do we make this progression? And why would I want to hold on? Why wouldn't I just let go? Well, then I'll just hit you.
So for those of you who are listening to the podcast rather than watching it, just so for illustrative purposes, Sensei is actually going from someone taking a wrist and demonstrating sort of the subtleties of angle and sort of extrapolating on that. And I would, particularly this part, I would love for you to go to the YouTube page and actually watch this, because it's a very intriguing breakdown of a very simple concept that is so very complex. My apologies for the interruption, Sensei.
That's okay. You know, because once you learn your from Uke's perspective, once you learn your own body movement and sense of stability in that movement, just like a ballerina learns, just like anybody that has any kind of a football player. I don't follow football, American football. I watch a couple of games a year. But what do I watch? I watch how they move. I watch how they misdirect. I watch how they spin. All of that I marvel at the athleticism. And so once Uke learns this principle of athleticism, then they can attack harder and faster and stronger, right? Yeah. As they're attacking somebody with more experience. And that way it begins to resemble. And then if there's an agreement, or as I do with my students, I totally give them an opening. There's a door. I don't tell them, I purposely give them a door. If you didn't find that door, then, you get whacked on the head. Oh, hey, you're supposed to be listening. You're attacking. I totally gave you a door to turn this around. It should have been turned around, but you missed the door, and I still was able to do the technique. So, I believe that kind of training. I mean, and it happens. I believe when I have trained with the karateka that I've trained with, it happens. I've never run into somebody as you're not going to do this. But we run into that in Aikido too. You're not going to move me. I go, well, I would just hit you then. We can play that game, but it's not real life.